Do you love Little Debbie Christmas tree cakes? Are you excited about trying to piece this shape as a quilt block? If that sounds interesting for you, make sure to subscribe to my channel on YouTube as I come out with cool quilting videos like this every week. Hello my quilting friends, my name is Leah Day and I am a long arm machine and sewing machine dealer and online quilting teacher. And I love challenging myself to come up with creative crafts, fun things that we can make together, and to use all of these cool materials and machines that we have available to us today. So how are we going to make this block in fabric and thread? Well, I thought about this quite a bit and I realized there were actually two different techniques we could use, and they work equally good to make this quilt block. I ran some polls and I asked quilters which technique they would prefer to learn, and they were 100% evenly matched. Everyone wanted improv curve seam piecing and bias tape applique and just wanted to learn more about these techniques and to see how they work. So I decided I'll just do this video and share both techniques so you know how to do it. You know, two different options for making your Little Debbie Christmas tree cake block. And we're gonna play with three different materials that you can use to create your sprinkles. So this is going to be a slightly longer quilting tutorial. I would love it if you stick around for the whole thing, but I have added chapters in the bottom, so if you know the quilting technique that you're most interested in learning, you can jump ahead to the section of the video that you most want to watch. Of course, if you stick around, that helps me out a lot, that helps my channel out a lot, but what will help me the most is if you post a comment, ask a question, or share the video with your quilting friends. So now that we know what we're making, let's get started first with improv curve seam piecing. So I'm getting started with two squares of fabric, white and red, and I'm making sure that both of these are right side up on my cutting mat, and I'm leaving about 1 inch gap of white to the right hand side, and that's important. You'll find out why in just a bit. Now I cut a very shallow curve. You can't go really deep with improv curve seam piecing. You have to use a shallow curve for this. Line those fabrics up. We're going to stitch this curve together. Now at my machine, I line these up again, making sure that they are right sides together, and I get started stitching. Now you do not have to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can go with a narrower seam allowance, and that might actually make this a little easier. I found it was just a little bit easier on my little Rebel sewing machine to use a narrower seam allowance when fitting these together. And this is sort of a force fitting technique. You can see I just line up about 1/2 inch in front of my foot. I stretch it just a little bit just to keep those fabrics in alignment, and I'm kind of force easing the fabrics together as I go. You know, this is improv. It's a modern quilting technique. It doesn't have to be perfect. And really important tip, you are not going to have the fabrics end on the same point. They're going to be off slightly when you get to the bottom edge, and that's exactly right. You want to just allow them to end where they end. So now at my pressing board, I'm going to finger press those seam allowances open and flat, and then I'm going to look for anywhere that the fabrics are being a little weird, maybe refusing to lay flat, in which case I just grab my scissors and clip into the fabrics, and that will encourage them to lay down and behave. Now I'm going to press with a hot, dry iron. This would be a situation where you might want to use steam. Steam will help to encourage those fabrics to relax and lay flat. You may see, however, some sign of fabric struggle, a little bit of pleating, puckering. That's pretty normal for this technique, so don't worry about that too much. Just go on ahead and grab your fabrics and we're going to make another slice. Now we want narrow red strips. That is kind of the look we're going for to make it look like a Christmas tree cake. So I am leaving only about between 1/2 to 3/4 inch between the red and the new curve that I'm cutting now. So layer those fabrics again right side up, both fabrics right side up, cut another curve, go back to your sewing machine and sew those curves together. Now you might be wondering if you can use a ruler like my Super Slide or Mini Slide rulers. I found with Super Slide, my curves ended up just too deep. They were too much of a struggle, too challenging to piece with this technique. Mini Slide, however, worked really well for this technique. I ended up with some really nice soft curves, and that worked out great. But you know, the whole point is improv curve seam piecing, and this is what you're going to end up with, a very improv, very random quilt block. Now when it comes to actually cutting out our tree shape, I measured my block and I ended up with a 7.5-inch square. I'm going to fold this in half to find a center point, and then now I'm going to cut a triangle out of this square. So lining up the tip of my ruler with the midpoint of the block, I'm just kind of eyeballing this and looking at it and deciding where I want that triangle shape to go, pressing firmly with my ruler and cutting across. And then of course understand that you can always play around with this. If you decide you don't like the angle that you cut, keep trimming until you get the angle that you like. You might even want to grab a Christmas tree cake to double check yourself and make sure that you've got the right angle and that you're making sure things are lining up nicely. I had 2 boxes of Christmas tree cakes, and I gotta say, guys, there's not much left now after doing this tutorial. I had to check quite a lot just to make sure things were lining up well. So there we go. That is our triangle cut. And now we need to think about the wedge shape. You know, the bottom of a Christmas tree cake has that little wedge shape on the bottom, and I realized that the extra pieces left over from the sides around our triangle is the perfect place to cut our little wedge. So I cut a little 2.5-inch strip from that piece, that little scrap, and then I just folded that in half using that same angle I had cut before. I took that little scrap, folded it in half, and cut a wedge shape, making sure that the bottom of the block ended in white and then the top of the wedge ends up in white. That's why it's important to leave that 1-inch spacing of white fabric whenever you cut your first curve. Now for our background fabric, and this is going to be the same method that we use for both styles of blocks, I'm going to cut a 14-inch square. I'm going to place my triangle on top, and I'm measuring down about 2 inches from the top of my square. Line up my block, and I folded that in half just to find a midpoint, and now I line up my ruler with wherever that triangle ends up, and I cut straight across. So basically I'm just ending up with the top of the block that's going to be pieced around the triangle, and then the bottom of the block, which is going to be pieced around the wedge shape. But set that aside. I found it was really easy to miscut if you try and work with the wedge shape first. You really need to piece the top of your block first. So line up your ruler with the edge of your Christmas tree triangle and go on ahead and cut that first side, and then just rotate around in order to cut the opposite side. And I'm always making sure to cut with my dominant hand. I am left-handed, so you'll have to reverse this if you're right-handed, and it is very important to always be cutting with your dominant hand for safety's sake. Now take out the triangle of background fabric, and you're going to first piece on the smaller piece of background fabric. I'm just going to stitch that with a 1/4-inch seam here. Loving my little Rebel. Oh my gosh, it is so fast, it is so powerful, and it is so easy to stitch on these blocks. I really got to know this machine as I was making these Christmas trees. All right, finger press that seam allowance open and give it another good press with a hot, dry iron. And you're going to have to do a little trimming because this is also improv piecing, and you're going to have a little bit of extra background fabric extending on both sides of that seam. So here I lined everything back up again and trimmed off that little extra of fabric, and then lined back up again with that larger piece of background fabric. Flip it over, right sides together, and stitch it with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. But just like before, it really honestly doesn't matter if it's a perfect 1/4-inch. You can really piece this however you want. Now I'm pressing that seam allowance open one more time, and then the final step, for the upper part of the block at least, is to trim off that bottom edge. That just ensures that we're working with a nice straight line as we piece on the bottom part of our Christmas tree cake. All right, so now that that is trimmed up nicely, fold the entire triangle in half, lining up those seams so you find the midpoint of the Christmas tree. Do the same thing with that bottom wedge shape. And you're going to line up so that roughly the middle of that strip of bottom fabric is lined up with the upper part of your block. Line up your wedge shape and then just line up your ruler right along the bottom edge of that wedge and go ahead and cut the bottom part of your background fabric into 2 pieces. Now we're going to work with that upper part. And this is the only part that I really found could get tricky, and that was just simply making sure that we did not cut this strip of fabric too short. So I take my wedge, it's in the center, and I'm going to nudge it over just by about 1/4 of an inch. It's giving me that little extra space that I need for seam allowance. Okay, so that piece is cut. Now I'm going to take my opposite side and I'm lining up the bottom corner of the wedge with the bottom corner of the other strip. That's meaning that I'm only going to be cutting away a small triangle of that background blue strip. And that's important because I found, making quite a few of these, that it's very easy to end up with the strip coming out too short. So piece both of those seams, end up with a nice strip, nice wedge being connected to the bottom of your Christmas tree cake block. Piecing from here is so simple. You simply stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance right across, add in your bottom strip, and your block is complete. Now I am trimming up my quilt block to 12.5 inches square. That means that when I piece this with other things, it will end up being a 12-inch quilt block. If you wanted a bigger block, all you have to do is start with a bigger background square of fabric. And there we have it. That is our Improv curved seam piece Christmas tree cake quilt block. I love it. So now what about this other quilting technique? And that is called bias tape applique. And this allows us to get a much more swirly icing style. Now I'm working with double fold 1/4 inch wide bias tape, but of course you can work with anything that you prefer. You can even make your own bias tape if you like. Give it a press to work out any folds. And I did make a template for this block. I found that it was just easier and waste a lot less bias tape to make a template of your triangle. So use graph paper and mark a 6.5 inch vertical line and then intersect that with a 6 inch horizontal line, and you're going to end up with a perfect triangle for our trees. I am roughly outlining this template onto my fabric, and I've layered this onto a piece of stabilizer. I found that the bias tape applique could definitely pull on this just a single layer of fabric just a little bit too much. So I do think a cutaway stabilizer is a good idea. Now to start applying our applique, all you have to do is wiggle your bias tape into position, get it where you like it, and then give it a press. Applying heat to bias tape encourages it to lay flat and to remember that curve. Now I'm applying glue. This is just Elmer's glue, and I put it into my micro tip glue bottles, and that allows me to apply a very thin, very thin line of glue to that fabric and then be able to press it in place. So I'm wiggling that into position, and then I'm going to press with my hot dry iron. Now, I like that method and it works pretty good, but I sometimes find that it limits my creativity. I might not make it as wiggly as possible. So this time I marked first, I marked the wiggly line, then I applied glue onto the marked line, and then I pressed my bias tape in place. And I found that I ended up with an even more wiggly line than I probably would have ended up with otherwise. So understand there's not really a wrong way of applying this. I do know that there are fusible webs, 1/4 inch wide fusible webs and stuff that you can use too. I just find it a little bit easier to use glue. You can also use wider bias tape, and here I'm trying some wider single fold bias tape just so you can see what it's going to look like. I found that the tricky thing about wider bias tape is it might not want to lay flat. You might end up with little weird spots like that where the bias tape is wanting to flip up on you. And so in that case, what you want to do is kind of use your iron to force it flat. Give it a new memory. A little bit of heat and a little bit of stretching encourages bias tape to lay nice and flat and behave itself well. So when in doubt, give it some heat. Now, once you get multiple pieces glued in place, we still have to think about that little wedge shape. And I found that to be a little tricky with this block. The easiest way to take care of it is to add one more single strip of bias tape to the bottom of your fabric. And I just did this as a very gentle curve down here at the bottom. And once I pressed this in place and cut it as part of my Christmas tree cake block, I found that I could actually cut quite a few little wedges from this little end. So this ended up saving quite a lot of time and was much, much easier to piece this way. So once you get everything pressed in place, it's time to stitch. On my little Rebel sewing machine, I am stitching just right along the edge of the bias tape. My needle is probably hitting maybe 1/16 of an inch away from that folded edge. Then I stitch down and stitch along the opposite edge. So stitching to the right and stitching to the left. And this does take a little bit of time, but it looks amazing. It blends perfectly when you use matching color thread. Now we have that template for a reason, so we can get nice placement. I want to make sure my bias tape is at least 1/4 inch from the bottom edge of the block. And that again has to do with piecing those wedge shapes it just can look a little bit odd if you don't have white fabric connecting them together. So there we go, I cut the bottom, and then now it's just going to be exactly like cutting with our other Improv curved seam piecing. Line it up, cut your angles, only this time we have a template, and that does make it just a little bit easier. Making templates is not difficult. You can see my sizes directly marked on the template here. I have a 6.5 inch height, 6 inches in width, and I did add 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around just to make sure that I was going to end up with the size of triangle that I wanted. So understand that you can make yourself a template or not. It's entirely up to you. Now let's cut out the wedge for the bottom of our Christmas tree cake block. I found that my template number 1, Dresden template number 1, can actually cut a pretty cute wedge shape using just the bottom narrow end of that template. But of course, if you don't have this template, that's okay. Just use the same instructions that I did before, cutting a nice angle, folding it in half, and cutting the opposite angle that we did with our Improv curves. So there we go. We have all of the pieces in place. I cut my background fabric already, and we're going to stitch this the same way. Stitching on the smaller piece of background, larger piece of background, piecing the wedge shape to both sides of the strip, and then the bottom strip of our block. And this is a much bigger block because I used a fat quarter in this case. So there is our bias tape applique. I love that effect. And of course, both blocks look great with a little bit of sprinkles on top. So the first technique I tried was with hot fix crystals, pressing these in place. And I believe these were pretty big, so they had to be pressed for 20 seconds each. I did like the effect, but those very, very time consuming, and I'm going to have to put quite a lot of sprinkles on these blocks. So then I decided to try Kimberbell's glitter sheet. I had leftover pieces of this, some scraps left over, and it was a perfect time to start using these up. Now, to use Kimberbell's sheets, you have to peel off the top layer of vinyl. It's kind of a thin, clear layer that goes on top of the glitter, and holds the glitter in place. And then I first tried to use my hole punch in order to cut circles. I thought that that would be a good idea. Well, I didn't realize that my hole punch was still full of other stuff. Made a really, really big mess. And then when I tried cutting out more, I just found it was really hard to get the little glitter circles out of my hole punch. That really just totally didn't work. So I thought about it some more and realized, sprinkles are squares and rectangles. They're not really circles. So I just ended up cutting a little strip of the material and then cut that little strip into squares and rectangles. And that, I felt like, really ended up looking the best. I like this color, but it's a little bit light. It's a lighter color green than what I feel like the Christmas tree cake sprinkles are. But this is very, very easy. Has a 15 to 20 minute press, and you can press all of it in place all at the same time. I think that's really, really easy. The last material I used was this 405 iron-on vinyl. So again, I cut a narrow strip and randomly cut squares and rectangles in order to create my glitter. This presses again in 15 to 20 seconds and it adheres permanently to the fabric. Now it did have a note on the instructions, and the instructions were really, really good for the 405, and that is to wait to wash your garment or your project for 24 hours after you have pressed this in place. I did not follow those instructions, and you can see not a single piece lifted off. So which one do you think looks the most like a Christmas tree cake sprinkles? So that's it for this quilting video. Did you prefer improv curve seam piecing, or do you plan on trying bias tape applique? Which of these niche quilting techniques are you planning to try for this block? I'd love to know in the comments below, and also how you plan to add a little glitter and bling to your Christmas tree cake blocks. I ended up liking this darker green vinyl, this iron-on vinyl, the best, but that's just me. And I did find that just cutting it in strips and cutting little rectangles and angles and stuff was much, much easier than trying to use a hole punch. So I hope that that helped you and definitely saved you some time trying to add sprinkles to your quilt blocks. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the sewing machine that I used in this video, it is the Little Rebel home sewing machine. It is designed for piecing and amazing machine quilting. And you can come and learn more about it at leahday.com/rebel. Of course, this block, the Christmas tree cake block, is a riff on another quilt pattern that I shared many years ago, and that is called the Wonky Christmas tree quilt pattern. You can come and find that full write-up, very, very detailed quilt pattern and tutorial at leahday.com/tree. You'll also find some quilting suggestions if you're wondering how to machine quilt these blocks. What are some cool designs to use in the background and over your trees? So come and check that out at leahday.com/tree. And until next time, let's go eat cake.